Okay, so today I'm basically going to talk about how women in climate research can use their work for societal benefit. I suppose another way of looking at this is the fact that climate research is really one of the most societally relevant lines of academic inquiry in the world today. So what I'm going to look at is, what is the role of of women in climate research? How can we increase their role, but also really, how can we increase not just their participation, but also their impact and influence in the field? So I think the question is relevant. I mean, maybe the reason for this is obvious, but I think there's no harm in stating it. I think that diversity fosters creativity, and creativity leads to good science. And traditionally, climate research has really been the domain of men. It's basically been the domain of white men in Western civilization, and basically we need more diversity in climate research, not just in terms of gender, but also in terms of culture. And I'm also interested in this question, both I suppose from a professional and a personal perspective. I'm the chief editor of Nature Climate Change, and Nature Climate Change is basically a new publication which is being launched by the publishers of Nature. Most of you will know Nature, I suspect. It's a weekly science magazine. It's the most important weekly science magazine, or the most influential in the world. And in the last 10 years, we've basically launched a number of more specialist journals, from Nature Genetics to Nature Medicine, Nature Physics. And I'm launching the most recent of these. So Nature Climate Change will basically focus on climate research, but also on the impacts of climate change for the economy, for policy, for society, for the world at large. And it's going to be a completely interdisciplinary publication, but that makes me one of the very few female chief editors of a climate research journal. So most of my peers are men, and most of them are in their 50s and 60s, and they're professors in research institutes. And granted, they have also got full-time academic careers, whereas I left research 7 years ago. And one of the reasons I left research was, it was mostly really, I suppose, a decision to go into communications, because I felt more passionate about communicating science than doing scientific research. But certainly, I think one of the reasons for me was also the glass ceiling. I got my first research position straight out of my PhD, and I moved to the UK to become a researcher at a fisheries research institute, where I was managing an EU project. And there were probably 450 people in that research institute, and I think there was one female academic who was at a higher level than me. Everyone else was male, apart from the people in administration. And I think I just lacked any really female mentors, and I felt a need for mentorship that I didn't have in my career at that stage. And I think that that's true for many young women who leave research. And actually, if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that the statistics bear this out. This basically is data on women in geosciences in the US, and what you'll see from this is that at the undergraduate level, about 42% of students are female. But as you go further and further up the ranks, the percentage of females decreases. And I think there's a particular postgraduate brain drain where the real loss of females tends to happen at that crucial stage between the PhD and getting that full-time position, getting a tenure position. That's where most women leave research. So I guess one of the questions really is whether this sort of loss of women in the geosciences is also true for climate research. So I think it probably was once true for climate research, because climate research used to be the domain of atmospheric scientists and geoscientists. But what's interesting is that that's no longer the case. So I think we're seeing a shift in focus in climate research, which means that it's now a completely interdisciplinary field. And that's fascinating, both in terms of research opportunities, but also in terms of opportunities for women. And one of the reasons that this is happening is because of the advances that we've made in the science in the last few decades, really. So I think what I'd say is that we now have probably a fairly good, if imperfect, grasp of the physical climate system. We know that the climate is warming, and that it has done over the past few decades. We have evidence that this is unequivocal. We also know that in the last few decades that we've been primarily responsible for that warming. And we know that largely thanks to the work of atmospheric scientists, paleoclimatologists and climate modelers, and most of those have been male. But now we're seeing a shift in research. So as Tara pointed out, we many uncertainties remain, and those uncertainties are partly still uncertainties in the physical climate system. For example, how climate's going to change on regional scales and what the impacts will be. Whether we'll end up with a loss of sea ice in the Arctic is still something that is really hotly debated. We don't know what the rate of change will be in the future, and that's partly because, you know, we can't predict how society will respond. But I think less certain still is how we will respond as individuals and how we will respond as a society to the problem. And what's interesting about that is that, I mean, we don't know the answers to questions such as, you know, how, for example, do we get people to just drive less and fly less? We have this situation at the moment where we know there's a problem, we understand the problem, but international and national efforts to tackle it are completely flailing. And I think that this presents a new opportunity, and it's an opportunity for psychologists, for sociologists, for anthropologists, as much as for you know, physicists or chemists or geoscientists. So basically we have what I think is a grand challenge now. I mean, it's ample cause for concern that we, I suppose, haven't tackled the problem, that we recognise the problem when we haven't tackled it, but it's also a new opportunity for science. And that's extremely interesting because I think that that also presents a new opportunity for women. And I think from the next slide you'll see why that is. As I said, I think it's now truly interdisciplinary. And what we're seeing is that if you look at the statistics, say at a postgraduate level for humanities and the arts, or for social sciences and business, women are basically far better represented. So, you know, at a postgraduate level, you've got more than half of the students are basically female in humanities and the arts, and almost half are in the social sciences and business. And that compares to 25% in engineering and technology. And I think that this carries on up the ranks to some extent. So the proportion of women who are full professors in the humanities is 27%, which compares to like 8%, I think, in the geosciences. So I think what this shows is if you look at the body of climate research as a whole, as an interdisciplinary field that spans both the natural and the social sciences, there are tons of new frontiers opening up, and these are frontiers for women as well as for men. But I guess one of the things that concerns me is that while there are more and more women becoming engaged in climate research, what we're not seeing is women having the same impact as men. And I guess it's hard to sometimes measure impact in research, but one of the ways we can do that is through your publication rate. I mean, I guess there's a famous dictum in science which is publish or perish, and that, you know, sums up fairly nicely how important it is to publish if you're a scientist. It's really your sort of ticket to tenure. And I think that there isn't much hard data on whether women are publishing as much as men, but what we can see is there was one recent study, I think it was published last year, that showed that on average female academics publish 21% less than their male counterparts. And I think what's interesting about this is that it's skewed by a number of extremely high publishing individuals. You get this phenomenon in science where you get some people who are just prolific at publishing. And 89% of those prolific publishers, which are defined as people who publish 10 papers or more a year, 89% of those are men. And I think what's also concerning is the fact that this sort of gender bias tends to proliferate to influential positions in organisations. So if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN body that assesses the state of climate science and is really influential in determining future directions in climate science research, this has a bureau of 45 members. And of those 45 members, currently 6 are women, but none of those women are in the top 3 levels of that bureau. So it's completely, well, not completely, but almost entirely dominated by men. And I think if you look more broadly at female voices, whether it's in the blogosphere or in op-eds in newspapers or just, you know, publishing in journals, there are very few female voices in this debate. And I guess the question is, why is that? So, you know, it used to be the glass ceiling or the old boys club, and interestingly there was a paper that came out in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences 2 weeks ago, and it said, we no longer have an old boys club, we're not facing the glass ceiling anymore, what we now have is an invisible web. And the invisible web apparently tells us that actually we're not being discriminated against. The evidence suggests that we're not being discriminated against when it comes to getting a job, or there's no bias in peer review in the peer review process against women, but actually there are existing social, biological and institutional barriers that are just preventing us from getting ahead, and some of those are just things like social expectations, trade-offs between a family and a career. That's still a major issue. How do we get around that issue? So that's preventing females progressing further, particularly in the hard sciences and in sciences like physics, chemistry, geosciences. So, I guess the question of how we get around that is a really big one, but I guess there are certain things that we can do. For me, I suppose I feel particularly passionate about female mentorship, and I'm quite pleased that on the journal that I'm launching, we have 4 editors and 3 of them are females. And I was curious to see whether this would actually, encourage more women to submit to the journal. I don't have any hard evidence on that yet, but it's interesting if you look at there's a study that came out from the US National Academy of Sciences in 2009, and that suggested that if there are females on the board of, say, for example, a grant proposal or a job application, this actually increases the number of females in the candidate pool, almost as though females feel that they will be more well received, their application will be more well received if there are females on the receiving end. And I wondered whether this was true for journals too. Research shows that most journal editors are male. We have, 3 of our 4 of our editors are female. Also, we've set up an advisory panel, and I think 50% of the advisory panel is female. Also, I guess we try to, choose referees and authors with awareness. Obviously our bottom line is always to choose the expert in the field and the person who is best, but often that person is female, is what we're finding, so we're just trying to be increasingly aware of that. As for the broader issues of how you tackle all of those sorts of invisible web issues of social and technological barriers, I don't know, but I'd love to hear if people have any thoughts on that today. Thanks.